Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
President Trump and the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. We expect we will hear from the two of them shortly as reporters are led in to the Oval Office. And in the meantime, I wonder if President Trump is making some comparisons between the central bank Meloni is working with right now compared to the central bank that he is working with. The Fed and the ECB obviously on two different tracks as the ECB cut rates for a seventh time today. And the chairman of the Fed obviously signaling that the Fed is going to stay on hold. President Trump taking note of that, not too happy with it. As he posts on Truth Social, too late Jerome Powell of the Fed, who was always too late and wrong, yesterday issued a report which was another and typical complete mess, going on to say too late should have lowered interest rates like the ECB long ago, but he certainly should lower them now. Powell's termination, Joe, cannot come fast enough.
Okay, so fast forward to Section 10 of the Federal Reserve Act, and you start wondering exactly what authority the president has here. That's why we wanted to spend some time with Mike McKee. He knows this stuff inside and out, of course. Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent with us from World Headquarters in New York. Mike, great to see you. I'm sure your antennas went up as soon as the Truth Social post went here. Here's the deal. Can be, quote, removed for cause by the president, unquote. Does not cutting rates equal cause?
No, that's the general consensus of the legal world. I must say that so far the consensus on social media is that always late is probably the worst nickname Trump has ever given anybody. It just has no rhythm to it.
Always late and wrong.
Traditionally, for cause has been seen as malfeasance or illegality, something like that. A policy difference is not for cause. However, this president is not traditional, and he has tried to fire people who, in theory, he could not because they had for cause clauses in their founding acts, including the head of the National Labor Relations Board. And that case has been going back and forth through the court system. She's been hired and fired back several times by different judges. The Supreme Court hasn't agreed to necessarily take that case yet, but Chief Justice John Roberts has issued a stay of an appeals court order that ordered her back to work. So the suggestion is the court may take it. Now, if the court does rule against Gwyn Wilcox, is the woman's name, then there is some thought that that could apply to the Fed as well. However, there is one other, and I'm going to bore you with this information. There's one other case called Sela Law, which was when the administration tried to fire the head of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And the court ruled that a single agency head, independent agency like the CFPB, the president could get rid of. But the Fed is not a single head. While Jay Powell is the chair, it's a 7-member board, and the actions the Fed takes can only be taken because the entire board agrees. So that was the basis for why Jay Powell said yesterday in Chicago that he didn't think that the lawsuit that is proceeding on the NLRB would apply to the Fed. But Donald Trump, that's all you got to say. Nobody knows.
Well, yeah, and of course, this isn't necessarily a new topic of conversation. As Joe alluded to, the president has expressed displeasure with Jerome Powell before, which is why yesterday, before this True Social post even hit, when he was speaking at the Economic Club of Chicago, Chairman Powell was asked directly about this question of independence and whether he could be fired. This was his response, as you heard live in the room, Mike.
Our independence is a matter of law. Congress has, in our statute, we're not removable except for cause. We serve very long terms, seemingly endless terms. So we're protected in the law. So, Congress could change that law, but I don't think there's any danger of that. Fed independence has pretty broad support across both political parties.
And it seems that there's support from elsewhere in the administration for Fed independence, Mike, even if not from the president himself. It was just on Monday that the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told our colleague Anne-Marie Hordern that the independence of monetary policy is a jewel box that needs to be preserved. Does that actually maybe indicate that there are voices who would act to check the president on this one?
Well, I think there definitely are voices. Anybody who's had experience with financial markets would know that any attempt to fire the chairman of the Fed would be received very badly. And there's a report from Politico today that Scott Bessent has been over to the White House saying, kind of knock these tweets off the idea. Don't say you're going to fire him. And there was a report earlier that a senior White House official was saying this wasn't a threat. This was just the president venting. Now, that's going to keep happening. Nobody's going to shut Donald Trump up, and when he doesn't like something or wants something out of the Fed, like everybody else, he's going to attack them. So the question is really, does he follow up? And probably he wouldn't make a decision until the the National Labor Relations Board decision comes down from the Supreme Court, and he gets advice on whether it could possibly apply. So I don't think there's any danger in the short term this is going to happen, and probably we won't hear more from the president, given everything else he's doing right now, until we get close to the next Fed meeting on May 7th.
All right, which, of course, Michael McKee will have covered for us, as always. Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent joining us from New York. Thank you so much. And as we consider, Joe, the kind of legal questions here, it was just weeks ago after the firing of the two Democratic commissioners at the Federal Trade Commission that we spoke with then ousted Commissioner Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, who told us, look, if it can happen to me, there is nothing to say that it's not also applicable to the chair of the Federal Reserve.
Connected the dots straight to the top of the Fed as we're discussing here today. Look, I don't know. There are a lot of different ways that you can look at this. We'll see if they try to establish some sort of cause, or maybe just the president having a cathartic moment online. It wouldn't be the first time.
Oh, no, it certainly would not. So on that note, let's turn to our political panel, who is all too familiar with us asking them about each and every post on Truth Social. Rick Davis is with us, partner at Stone Court Capital and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Caitlin Legacki today. Rick, I do wonder if you see this as just venting, or when the president says that someone can't be terminated fast enough, that he's suggesting he wants to do that in short order.
Yeah, look, I mean, we have to look at what this administration has been doing, and they are testing the powers of the presidency on a systematic basis by taking actions that heretofore have been considered extra legal and letting the courts tell them whether or not it's okay or not. And I think it's kind of an 80-20 thing for this administration. I wouldn't be surprised that there isn't a conversation that's been had, not just a random Trump tweet, that is why in the world wouldn't the president have higher fire authority over the leadership of the Fed, regardless of who's in charge? And should we try to test that in the courts? Because he's got a compliant Supreme Court. They are more likely to be supportive of his strong executive branch actions than any other court we've seen in a long time. And so I see no reason why this doesn't fit into that same category. Whether it's a good idea or not, I mean, we would want to defer to Secretary Bessent, who says that it's a jewel box, and I like jewel boxes. We should keep those.
No, the jewel box, or if it's the lock box that Al Gore was talking about here. Caitlin, in an interview with Bloomberg Business Week on June 25th, right? So less than a year ago. This is campaign trail. Donald Trump said if reelected, he would let Powell finish his term, adding, quote, especially if I thought he was doing the right thing, unquote. Which Trump do you believe?
I believe the Trump that's tweeting in the middle of the night. He's very skilled at telling people what they want to hear in the moment that he's trying to get what he wants. But we have seen over and over again that Trump does not like it when people put up any sort of resistance to him or his goals. And it's clear from his truth social posts or his tweets or whatever you want to call them, that he's getting very frustrated with Powell. And so I think it's hugely concerning. I think that they're absolutely trying to test the fences and see what they can get away with. And I wouldn't be surprised if they try to see what is on the table in terms of changing leadership at the Fed.
Well, as we've been discussing, Caitlin, a lot of that may actually be left up to the decision of the Supreme Court in the NLRB case, given that we have seen kind of splits in the justices in terms of when they are and are not willing to rule with this administration on the efforts it's made in the last nearly 90 days. How do you expect the court ultimately comes down on this, knowing that it hasn't always been kind to kind of regulatory authorities in general?
Yeah, I think that Rick was right when he said that Trump's working with a compliant and a friendly Supreme Court. I think where there is some measure of hope for Democrats or Powell supporters or people who are just opposed to Trump is that ultimately someday the shoe will be on the other foot. And I think there are a number of, Supreme Court justices who wouldn't want to extend that same power to Democrats. Or progressives when they are in power. And so I think that's an important kind of seatbelt and restraining factor, keeping some of these norms in place. But it's still very much the kind of court that seems inclined to expand executive power.
There was a time, Kailey, we were talking to Scott Bessent before he got the job. This also was during the campaign, about the idea of a shadow Fed
That's
chair.
right.
And we haven't heard a lot about that idea since. You wonder, Rick Davis, if maybe that's, forget firing the Fed chair, but could you cut him off at the knees or lower his authority by putting in place a shadow chair, doing something like that to check Jay Powell without actually showing him the door?
Yeah, I think this is the distinction between, are you upset with the individual Jay Powell or are you upset with the actions of the Fed? And if you're upset with the actions of the Fed, and he's indicated as much in his recent tweet, he likes what the ECB's doing. They've cut rates 7 times in the last 8 meetings. That's what he wants. Cut more rates. Give me lower interest. It'll help me get over some of the effect of inflation because of the tariffs. And so I think it's more driven by, policy. And so he's going to try and work the ref and make it very uncomfortable for Powell not to be more aggressive on rate cuts. And I think he's going to try and look, I'm sure, at what are the options to be able to pack the Fed with people who will be more compliant to his point of view. And in that regard, that's a game that other administrations have played for as long as there's been a Fed. And whether or not you could actually get somebody in there who's a shadow governor, who has so much access and authority to Trump that they would overshadow Powell, I think that's a real long shot. I think he's back to saying, hey, I want to get rid of Powell. I want someone in there who will do my bidding. And by the way, that's what he's done in every agency right now that reports to the executive branch.
But not every agency has the kind of sway over financial markets that the Federal Reserve does. And Caitlin, Mike McKee was just alluding to this notion. We already saw last week President Trump looking at what he described as queasiness in the bond market, and under guidance from Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Treasury Secretary Bessent, decided to pull back his tariff policy. What's to say that the threat of financial market disruptions will not also be a deterrent to him perhaps acting on his impulses when it comes to Chairman Powell?
I think that's the main thing and the only thing that is keeping him from acting on his impulses related to Powell. Because it does, if he takes the unprecedented step of trying to fire Chairman Powell, the markets will freak out. And I think it feeds into a larger narrative that Trump is facing headwinds on right now, which is that he is acting recklessly to ruin the economy. And this would simply feed into that. And so I think it is appropriate that Scott Bessent has raised these issues with him. I think it is pretty much the only thing that's keeping Trump in check right now. But it's a real concern, and I think it's a very powerful deterrent that is working in Powell's favor.
Fascinating conversation with our panel, Rick Davis and Caitlin Legacki. Thank you both for being with us today on the Thursday edition. We'll let you know, of course, what transpires on this front if we hear any more from Donald Trump. We are going to be hearing from the president, we expect, a bit later on this hour from the Oval Office in his bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister of Italy. Giorgia Meloni is in Washington and in the White House. And Kailey will talk a little bit more coming up here as we bring our listeners and viewers to the White House about reciprocal tariffs and whether Italy can carve out a deal on its own.
Yeah, especially when the administration's looking for not just action on tariff, but non-tariff barriers, maybe defense spending as well. We'll get into all of that ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Keeping an eye on the White House, where we are still waiting for the doors to open back up. In the meeting between President Trump and the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, they, of course, spoke to press briefly in the cabinet room as they were sitting down to lunch. They're expected to once again take some questions in the Oval Office really any minute now. But noteworthy, of course, that this visit is coming when it is and with who it is, considering Giorgia Meloni may very well be one of the closest allies President Trump has in Europe, most ideologically aligned, perhaps. And she's here as an emissary for the wider European Union to talk trade. That's
right. And, of course, to speak about maybe some carve-outs for Italy, which I suspect we'll be hearing about. We actually saw them both together at the beginning of their lunch. They gathered in the cabinet room, let reporters in for a couple of questions. I think she's a great prime minister, he said. We're very proud of her. I knew her right from the beginning. She's one of the real leaders of the world. And he looked up and said, I can't do better than that. And she had a chuckle. So clearly, this is going to be a little bit different than a meeting with some other European leaders who may be in Washington. Not an accident. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is at the White House right now, ahead of their meeting in the Oval Office. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, you said it there. President Trump really greeting Meloni with some high praise, as this meeting is largely seen as a test of their relatively warm relationship and whether or not that will be enough to push ahead trade talks with the European Union, which our reporting indicates haven't really made much progress in recent weeks. Take, for example, earlier this week, Bloomberg News reporting that the EU's trade chief left a meeting here in Washington with very little clarity about what this White House needs in order to get a deal done. Now, for his part, President Trump did tell reporters earlier that he sees no trouble with getting a deal done with the European Union. He said he's confident, but also in no rush. He also said, as you're about to hear here, despite these ongoing negotiations, that 10% baseline tariff across the board could ultimately get a little higher, indicating that even as the talks are getting underway, there's likely no plans to abandon the tariffs completely.
We're getting a 10% baseline. We took that down just because it was, the appropriate thing to do until we decide what the number will be. And we're, taking in a lot of money, which we've never done before, frankly. With Biden, we were losing a fortune on trade. But we're moving along very nicely, and we're going to end up with a baseline of a substantial number.
Well, this White House has previously said that it would be looking for the European Union to boost its energy imports of U.S. LNG, for example, as well as has made a priority asking our allies to up their defense spending when it comes to NATO commitments. We'll have to see as this goes, because Bloomberg News reporting new today that the EU is actually working on a proposal to potentially introduce some restrictions on some U.S. exports if negotiations don't go as planned. So already starting to work on that backup plan here, as the Italian Prime Minister says that she's hoping President Trump will make an official visit to Italy so he can meet with some other EU leaders face to face.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House for us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. And we want to get more analysis on what exactly we can or should expect coming from this meeting, and turn to Rachel Rizzo. Now, she's non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, joining us here on Balance of Power. Rachel, welcome back. It's good to have you. As we consider Giorgia Meloni as kind of the messenger and first immediate negotiator here, if you will, is she the best hope Europe has at trying to carve out a deal?
Well, I think so. I know that there's a lot of nervousness around the European Union that she would try to carve out benefits for Italy specifically, rather than coming to the White House and putting on a united front on behalf of the European Union. I'm not as nervous about that, because I do think Prime Minister Meloni does understand that she's in sort of a special position here. She really gets along with Elon Musk, who, as we know, is very close to the president. And she has a very similar worldview, especially when it comes to domestic issues, as Trump and his team. So I think what this means is that she's a good bridge between the United States and the EU during this time. And she speaks this sort of Trumpian language that I don't think other European leaders know how to speak. I mean, I know that von der Leyen, for example, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the commission, would probably love to come to Washington and meet with Trump one-on-one, but he doesn't want to meet with her. He does want to meet with Meloni, and this visit comes after a special invitation from Trump and his team.
Well, so what does von der Leyen or the rest of EU leadership think about the role that she's playing today, the way you just framed it? Is she their emissary?
In a way, I think she is. I mean, as I mentioned, I think that there is some trepidation on behalf of EU leaders. You've seen some statements come out, talking about the fact that Meloni had a special conversation with von der Leyen, where von der Leyen did make it clear that she better come to Washington and speak on behalf of the EU rather than focusing specifically on Italy. You've had some statements from, ministers of Europe, for example. The French Minister for European Affairs, Benjamin Haddad, in the Foreign Ministry, said the same thing over the last couple of days, that if Meloni comes into Washington talking on behalf of Italy, the European Union's 27 members are going to look divided. And that is, at the end of the day, a benefit for Trump and his team. So there's a lot riding on this visit for her. But I do think when you look at the relationship she has with Trump and his team compared to all of these other European leaders, she's the best person, in my opinion, to play this sort of role as an emissary between the two sides. This is a super stressful time between the two, trying to hammer out a lot of issues in terms of defense spending and trade. And I think that she's cut out for the job.
Well, to that point, Rachel, administration officials briefed reporters earlier today ahead of the visit and said, well, trade and tariffs will come up, that it wasn't going to be the focus of their conversation, but that they were going to talk about things like cooperation in space or energy or defense. To your point, can we really, though, separate those other issues from the trade negotiations that they want to get underway, knowing that this administration has talked not just about trade-specific, tariff-specific barriers, but non-tariff barriers and other components that you wouldn't necessarily lump into a bucket with trade policy is still being contingent on the outcome of these negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, no matter what you say about these meetings or whatever the White House says about these meetings, trade and tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers are going to be a discussion here. There's really no way around it. But this is also where Meloni comes in a pretty interesting position because, Trump has focused a lot on, for example, defense spending, not just during his second term, but on his first term, during his first term as well. He pushed NATO allies to spend 2% of their GDP on defense in line with NATO targets. And Italy is famously below that target. They're only spending about 1.5 of their GDP on defense right now. And so I think part of the other discussion that's going to happen in the White House today, there might be some stuff on Ukraine, we're not sure yet, but I do think Meloni is going to come in, as reports have said, and tell Trump that Italy is planning on getting to the 2% of GDP defense target that Trump and his team are really pushing. Now, unfortunately, this also comes at a time ahead of a NATO summit in June, where Trump and his team are expected to push NATO allies even farther, upwards of 3%. So this is a delicate balance that she's playing here. So there's a lot of factors that come into play when it comes to these potential conversations. But again, I think when it comes to who the EU is going to send as sort of an emissary, she's probably the best bet.
Well, how about just doing business for herself here? Could she secure carve-outs for Italy? We've talked about this today, whether it be cars, wine, or anything that's specific to the country that would then lead other European leaders to the White House to try to do the same. Is that something the EU is worried about happening?
Yeah, I think there is some worry here. And you're exactly right. When it comes to major Italian exports to the United States, things like wine, cheese, pasta, there's a nervousness, I think, on behalf of Italian exporters that this is going to hit them pretty hard, and American importers as well. People that own these like small businesses that rely on Italian imports. And so I think what we're nervous about seeing is that if she's able to get these carve outs, even if it's not on paper, even if it's just Trump talking in front of a bunch of reporters saying, oh yeah, we worked this out during lunch and we're going to carve out X, Y, and Z, that other EU leaders will see that as a sign that perhaps they should also take their own special trips to the White House to try to get their own carve outs. And that's, I think, where you could potentially see some trouble. But I think for this White House, what they're really pushing the Europeans to do is to work together with the United States on Chinese exports, on Chinese overcapacity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind as well.
But is there a risk Europe actually gets pushed closer to China in the process, Rachel?
Absolutely. And I think that this is a very delicate balance that this administration needs to strike. I mean, if you want the European Union to work together along with the United States against China's unfair trade practices, you have to make sure that you're not targeting the European Union for your own tariffs and your own trade war, which in turn would lead them to seek other partners and potentially deepen their partnership with China, because the United States is now seen as an unreliable ally, an unreliable partner in terms of trade. And so I do think there's a nervousness there, but with this 90-day pause, I think that does give some space, some wiggle room. Trump said today that there will be some sort of deal between the United States and the European Union. And I think that is potentially going to hinge on where the EU falls in terms of its own approach to China. And we just have to wait and see, I think, with time over the next 90 days into July, what that ends up looking like.
Rachel, it's always great to have you. Rachel Rizzo at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center with important analysis today as we prepare to hear from the president and the prime minister. Thank you, as always. They're still having lunch, Kailey.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't seen a readout on the menu, right? What do you serve the prime minister of Italy when they come over for lunch?
I would imagine you don't want to take your swing at Italian because she can get
probably
it better
not,
at home.
would be my guess. Yeah, well done steaks and burgers don't play that great in Rome either, though.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I wonder what they're serving for lunch at the White House. Do we get a readout on that? I'll let you know what we learn. With possible signs of life in the news today. Not at the White House. There seems to be a lot of life down there. But beyond our orbit and our solar system. Did you see this story? This is pretty cool stuff, and it has to do with the remarkable scientists who use the James Webb Space Telescope. If you missed this in your social media doom scroll this morning, let me be the first to tell you that this is the coolest story of the day. This team of researchers offering what it contends is the strongest indication yet of extraterrestrial life. You've heard stories like this, right? They found some blob out there. Maybe it had water on it. No, this is closer to the mark than we've ever come. A massive planet known as K2-18b, okay? That orbits a star 120 light years from Earth. Somebody's writing a really cool movie around this, I hope already. And the reason why it works out is because the two gases involved in Webb's observations of the planet are generated on Earth by living organisms, suggesting that the planet may be teeming with life. This is the kind of stuff we live for, right? This idea of hope beyond our own horizons. Unless the Doge is knocking, and this is something that we need to spend some time with Keith Cowing talking about. If you look at the approach that the Doge is making to not just NASA, but this particular program, Space.com suggesting the team overseeing NASA's James Webb Space Telescope have been directed to prepare for up to 20% in budget cuts that would touch on every aspect of the flagship observatory's operations. Keith Cowing's NASA Watch has been all over this as well. and he's with us right now. We usually have a launch underway when we get to talk to Keith, the editor, NASAWatch.com, astrobiology.com, former scientist with NASA. But we just got to talk today, Keith, and I'm wondering if this is something that worries you, or you're going to tell me, Joe, they're going to make it even more efficient, and the Webb Telescope's going to work better than ever.
Well, here's the thing. You make this discovery, and I don't want to put too much dampening on it, but it is kind of interesting. And it does cost money. The Webb cost us tax dollars a lot of money. The thing is doing more than it was ever expected to do, and it's making these discoveries as promised. So you hear all this talk about make America great in space again and all that. So what is their solution? Cut the funding to the people who are doing that. So it's a bit of a conundrum. Do you want the space stuff or not? But in terms of the discovery itself, I'm an astrobiologist by training. I used to work at NASA, blah, 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 blah. Did they find evidence of life? No. Okay, just to answer your question. There's no proof that there's anybody, little green men or anything like that, living there, okay?
Understood,
but
sure.
They found something in the atmosphere that on Earth comes from plankton and so forth in the ocean. Now, you can also say that it comes from pollution, so maybe we found a world that's polluted by aliens. Or there are other reasons why it could be there. But again, this is so far away. It's like, 124 light years. That's like 700 trillion miles. And they could see this sort of stuff. If they could see this, and maybe it isn't what they think it is, they could see this stuff and they can look elsewhere. So it may be more about learning how not to find things and then eventually find it. And you got to make, mistakes once or twice before you get things right.
I love that. That's just perfect analysis and context from Keith. Put the cuts in context then. If you're working at the Space Telescope Science Institute in Maryland and you've got to lop off 20%, what does that mean for your future innovation?
Well, right off the bat, if you read these papers, they say, hey, we looked at this planet and we see this stuff. We need to go back and get maybe 10 or 12 more hours, of use with the Webb Telescope. That means a bunch of people have to point it and watch it and get the data and so forth. And they're not the only ones using the Webb. There's people all over the U.S. and all over the world. If you cut back the ability to study this stuff, you cut back the science, and it may take you longer to get your answers because you may have to wait an extra year to get that observing time. So, money equals science. More money, more science. Less money, less science. It's simple. It's math.
That's okay. Well, you made that pretty simple, and I'm guessing that goes for the agency as a whole. What's DOGE going to do to NASA?
Well, it's an ever-changing thing. I mean, first of all, I started NASA Watch 30 years ago when there was another reduction in force, and I tried to shut it off then. I couldn't. I tried to retire this time, and it came back. This time it's coming back with a vengeance. And oftentimes you think that DOGE looks at the cost of things but not the value. And that can be problematic, especially with things like Webb and the space science. And just imagine this: you're in your dream job. You could make more money outside of the government, but you could do science for food if you had to. And now they're saying you've got your dream job, but we're going to cut 1/4 of your staff. Figure out how to do it, and we're not going to tell you who's going to get cut until the last minute. All right, I'm sitting there with a dream job on one shoulder saying it's good, and then you got DOGE on the other shoulder saying you're probably out of here. So how do you function in that environment? Luckily, people are pretty motivated at NASA, so they're still going.
Keith Cowing says they keep pulling me back in. Enter Jared Isaacman. I want to know your thought on this because I think you're a fan based on our prior conversations. This is the new NASA administrator. Here's a moment of him in a back and forth with Senator Ed Markey in his confirmation hearing just last week.
Was Elon Musk in your meeting when Trump offered you the NASA position at Mar-a-Lago?
Senator, I was interviewed by the President of the United States.
Was Elon Musk in the meeting when he offered you the job?
Senator, my meeting was with the President of the United States.
So Elon Musk was not in the meeting. Is that what you're saying?
Senator, I was being interviewed and speaking with the President of the United States.
You can just say he was not in the meeting. Was he in the meeting or not in the meeting?
Senator, I'm trying to be as transparent as I can. I was being interviewed by the President of the United States.
Keith, I'm not going to ask you if Elon was in the meeting, but you've got a billionaire here, a pilot, a commercial astronaut, and an innovator, and someone I believe, could help to reinvigorate this agency and maybe spend less money. Can he do more with less?
Yeah, and look, I've been a reporter covering NASA for 30 years, and I've done gotchas like that. Yeah, are you, did you, or whatever. And it's a classic thing, and they do it in the Congress too. But when you here in Washington, when you have a meeting with the president, there's like 5 Secret Service guys in the room, 5 or 6 aides. They're there just to be accessories. Yeah. The meeting was between him and Trump. And that, you don't talk about that. That's just kind of the way it works in Washington. That said, do I think Jared's the man? Yeah, I do. I really do. He's doesn't know any better than to read science fiction and to take something that he wanted to do as a little kid, and as he got rich, by coincidence, he could go make those dreams happen. And he flies in space, and he makes sure his crew is diverse. It's half women, half men. They do science, go out of their way to be the pin cushions for the needles and all that. And oh, by the way, a lot of people are talking about the 6 women who went to space the other day, saying it was whatever. He raised $250 million for St. Jude at the same time. So if I'm going to look at a billionaire who's going to run NASA, you want one with a heart, you want one with a vision, and you want one that pays attention to the real world as he makes these difficult decisions. So, I mean, if I were working there now, I'd be very comfortable with him about to come on board.
Does Elon Musk play a role in that, or does this not matter because he's on a plane to Texas soon?
I've known Elon everybody's known Elon forever. I mean, Elon is a presence. He has a company which is composed of thousands and thousands of very smart people who are creating a technology that makes it easier and more cost efficient for NASA to do things. So he's a factor, but he's going to be a factor like Jeff Bezos and a whole bunch of other people. The trick for Isaacman is to step beyond that and think of the American people's interest in their space agency and the exploration of space, and he brings this up all the time, inspiring young people to want to join in and be part of that adventure. To me, I'm about to turn 70. I'm a child of the Apollo era. Nothing is more important than grabbing kids at a young age, getting them fired up, and then giving them a path to become part of the adventure. So to me, that's the most important thing that Jared does, and he does it in spades.
Well, that's wonderful, and I appreciate the spirit of that comment, Keith. Does he have the charisma to convince Donald Trump of that? Obviously, Trump's very close with Elon Musk and has understood the benefits of privatization. What does Jared tell Donald Trump when they're alone?
Jared's he's walked the walk. He's flown twice. He's gone into space, and it's not without risk. That rocket could have a bad day. So you're taking a personal risk. I've been on expeditions to remote places. You're taking a risk, but there's a benefit that comes from that. And as far as, the whole what's going on in this White House, look, I live 22 miles away and I can't figure it out. But, that said, you pick the right guy to be able to say to the president, 2 and 2 is 4, 7 days a week. You want to go do this great stuff in space. I can't do it for free. I can find some fat, but at some point you got to write a check. You got to give me the ability to get my inspired people back on track and then stand back, because we'll do some really cool stuff.
So these proposed cuts in our remaining moment, Keith Cowing, may not be fixed. This is still up for debate. NASA may, in fact, have the resources that it needs.
They may cut some parts and not others. Again, this is all a bunch of kabuki theater. You don't know who's moving the puppets around, and it changes in a moment's notice here. And as you now know, we don't have one news cycle every day. We have 17.
Oh, God, I know it's true. What if they just renamed Artemis the Trump program? Wouldn't that help get us back to the moon? I have to think about that.
I don't know. Artemis is sort of like, he sort of started it, and then Biden kept it going. So it's got the ability to transcend politics. I wouldn't touch it.
Great to have you back, Keith. Thank you for helping us make sense of this amazing discovery. I'm holding out hope here. I just don't think we're ever going to make it that far away. NASAWatch.com is where you can find the great Keith Cowing. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.